Hey everyone, and welcome back to another explainer, where we take complex topics and break them down into actionable visual strategies. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're going to learn how to avoid the most common and frankly, the most devastating mistake that aquarium hobbyists make. We spend so much time and money building these incredibly beautiful, thriving aquatic ecosystems, but all of that hard work can literally be completely undone in a matter of days if we skip one crucial step. So today, we are mastering quarantine. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for keeping our tanks safe from disaster. First up, the hidden aquarium threat. Then, creating a buffer zone. Third, quarantine best practices. Fourth, avoid these common mistakes, and finally, prevention over panic. There's a quote from our source material today that just perfectly captures a really sudden, heartbreaking reality. Adding new fish to an aquarium is exciting, until it isn't. We've all been there, right? You go to the store, you find that absolute perfect fish you've been searching for. You bring it home, and you are just filled with anticipation. But then, a week later, that excitement turns to total dread, as you realize something is terribly wrong. And not just with the new arrival, but suddenly with your entire tank. Which brings us to a massive question, and one I want to pose directly to you right now. Why are so many established, totally healthy fish lost shortly after bringing a new one home? I think we tend to have this illusion that if a fish comes from a reputable store or a great breeder and it looks healthy in the bag, it's automatically 100% safe. But as we're going to see, that assumption is incredibly dangerous.
All right, Section 1, the hidden aquarium threat.
So the real danger to your display tank doesn't usually look like a sick fish. Even the most impeccably cared for, vibrant-looking fish can arrive harboring microscopic hitchhikers. We're talking parasites, bacteria, early-stage infections. These things can lay completely dormant. And the catalyst? Stress. The sheer stress from transport, being chased by a net, sitting in a bag, and then trying to adapt to an entirely new water chemistry in your home, that can instantly trigger those dormant issues. That seemingly perfect fish you bought can suddenly become a vector for a massive outbreak once its immune system tanks from the stress of the move. And this brilliantly illustrates the real stakes of the game here. On one hand, a quarantine tank treatment is a contained, totally manageable fix. On the other hand, treating a display tank is a complete nightmare. Suddenly, you're adjusting your entire filtration system, you're desperately trying to remove sensitive invertebrates or corals that absolutely can't handle copper or medications, and you are battling lingering pathogens in a massive, deeply established system. The emotional and financial stakes of treating a 100-gallon display tank are just astronomical compared to managing a tiny, isolated setup. What could have been a minor bump in the road becomes a full-blown hair-on-fire emergency. Which naturally brings us to Section 2, creating a buffer zone. So we know the threat is invisible, and treating the main tank is a nightmare. The solution? We need to create a buffer zone. Simply put, this is a physical quarantine space between the store or the breeder and your display tank. Its entire purpose in life is just to buy you time. Time to observe the fish, detect any of those stress-triggered illnesses we just talked about, and contain them. Honestly, think of this simple physical barrier as your display tank's absolute best insurance policy. It completely removes the gamble of introducing new livestock. But how do we actually set this up effectively? Well, here's an incredibly actionable directive from our source. You run that quarantine tank, and by the way, this can literally just be a separate small glass tank or even a clean plastic tub with a heater and a simple filter on the exact same water change schedule as your main aquarium. You want to keep the temperature and the water parameters perfectly consistent. Why? Because consistency reduces stress. We already know stress triggers illness. If your buffer zone has wildly different parameters than your main tank, you aren't helping the fish. You're just piling more stress onto the equation during a supercritical observation window. Moving right along to Section 3, quarantine best practices. Having a separate tank just isn't enough. We really need to know the exact protocols required to execute this strategy successfully. Observation comes first, and you need to know exactly what you're looking for. We're watching for changes in appetite, flashing, which is when a fish kind of quickly rubs its body against objects because it's irritated. Abnormal breathing, clamped fins, cloudy eyes, frayed tails, or those dreaded tiny white spots. And I really want to warn you, these symptoms can be incredibly subtle at the very beginning. A fish swimming just slightly differently, or maybe spitting out its food once, might be the very first early red flag of an impending crash. You've really got to be an active observer. So the crucial point here is establishing a rock-solid routine to catch those red flags. Number 1, daily observation. Number 2, maintain that stable water quality we talked about earlier. And number 3, and this one is vital, folks, feed conservatively. Look, it is so tempting to heavily feed a new skinny fish, but overfeeding in a small isolation tank will totally ruin your water quality. It spikes ammonia rapidly, which severely stresses the fish and makes it almost impossible to tell if a drop in appetite is due to an illness or just terrible water conditions. Modest portions are definitely your best friend here. And that brings us to our absolute golden rule. The guiding principle is containment. Whether you're someone who uses targeted treatment only after you clearly see symptoms, or you prefer doing structured preventative medications right out of the gate, the absolute non-negotiable rule is to keep the medicine out of your display tank. Any medication, any intervention whatsoever, must happen in quarantine. Protect that display at all costs. Let's pivot a bit. Section 4. Avoid these common mistakes. Because even with the best intentions, things can definitely go wrong. Quarantine usually fails due to inconsistent execution, not because the concept itself is flawed. We're talking about totally unforced errors here. Things like using uncycled filters that lead to toxic spikes. Actually, scratch that. It's more like skipping the daily water testing so you completely miss those spikes in the first place. Failing to match temperatures when transferring the fish, or simply just being impatient and holding the fish for way too short a period, completely missing the incubation window of a parasite. These are all completely preventable mistakes that render the whole buffer zone useless. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how incredibly mundane the biggest threat actually is. Cross-contamination. We are talking about sharing nets between the quarantine and your display tank, using the exact same siphon, drawing your hands on the same towel, plunging unwashed hands from one tank straight into the other. Remember, we are dealing with microscopic pathogens here. They can easily hitch a ride on a single tiny drop of water on a shared net, completely bypassing your entire buffer zone and destroying your main display. You have got to treat that quarantine tank like a biohazard lab. Separate equipment is absolutely mandatory. The overarching lesson here is that quarantine is not a passive activity. It is definitely not a set it up and forget it kind of deal. If you aren't engaging with that tank, tracking behavior, and testing water every single day, you are going to completely miss the early treatment window. Active daily engagement is literally the only way this works. Finally, Section 5, Prevention over Panic. Taking this explainer to heart really requires a behavioral shift. Let's look at how this builds our ultimate strategy. It rests on 3 key pillars: a dedicated, physically separate setup, a daily testing and observation routine, and a totally clear action plan for what to do when, and notice I said when, not if, signs of illness appear. When you combine these 3 things, you are no longer gambling. You're actively protecting the animals you already trust and care for in your main display. You can finally add new livestock with complete confidence, rather than pacing the room with anxiety. I absolutely love the core thesis from our source material here. Prevention is rarely dramatic, but it is the most reliable way to keep fish healthy. Doing water tests every single day on a small, bare-bottom tank? Yeah, it's boring. Waiting 4 to 6 weeks to add a cool new fish to your beautiful reef? Super boring. But you know what isn't boring? A tank crash. Ripping apart hundreds of pounds of rockwork to catch a dying fish is highly dramatic. Boring, consistent prevention is just far superior to exciting, devastating emergencies. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Think about your very next trip to the fish store. Will your next purchase be a routine, methodical success because you utilized a proper buffer zone? Or will it be the inciting incident for a full tank emergency? The choice and the health of your entire ecosystem is entirely in your hands. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Build that quarantine tank, protect your display, and I will see you next time.